Hi, I'm Holly Willis from the Institute for Multimedia Literacy, and I'm really delighted to introduce LizLosh. Liz has sort of gotten to know us over the last couple of years. She's been contributing a lot to the discussions and conversations that are happening in various places on campus around multimedia, new forms of scholarship, new forms of teaching and learning. And I think her broad range of interests really represents part of what we're trying to do with this group and the series as a whole, and also this particular track, which is titled Multimedia Literacy. It's a topic, obviously, that's very broad and has a lot of different components. And I think Liz's work in some ways represents a kind of breadth, but also astute analysis that I think is really inspiring. So I'm really pleased to have Liz. I'm going to read a little bit of her bio. Liz is currently the writing director of the Humanities Core course at UC Irvine and teaches courses in digital rhetoric and persuasive games. She studies public communication, persuasive video games, social marketing, public diplomacy, risk communication, and institutional branding. And she's recently completed a book titled Virtual Politic, an electronic history of government media making in a time of war, scandal, disaster, miscommunication, and mistakes, which is forthcoming from MIT Press. And the book is based on a blog, a daily online blog that Liz writes every day with the same title, which has won awards. Liz writes about discourses of the virtual state, media literacy, and policymakers and authority figures, and the rhetoric surrounding regulatory attempts to limit everyday digital practices. She's published many articles on these topics, and specifically on video games for the military and emergency first responders, government websites, national digital libraries, political blogging, new genres of online satire, congressional hearings about the internet, and state-funded online learning efforts. Her blog is really a must-read. If you haven't seen it already, I highly recommend it. It's a daily dose of great analysis. So, Liz.
Although, of course, I'm 2 days behind since I was getting ready for this talk, so apologies. Oops, what am I doing wrong? How do I get it to scroll down?
No, it could possibly go wrong.
That's right. What could go wrong? Okay, let's see. So I'm LizLosh, and I study institutions as digital media makers. And my first project, book project, which is coming out from MIT Press, is about the government as a digital media maker. The basic thesis of the book is that we're experiencing a period of political reaction that has to do with the anxieties of government stakeholders about the transportability of digital files and everyday media practices of citizens. The current project that I'm working on, which I'm going to sort of preview a bit here, is tentatively called Early Adopters, the Instructional Technology Movement, and the Myth of the Digital Generation. And in that case, what I'm looking at is e-learning. When I first started looking at institutions as media makers about 10 years ago, there was a relatively limited number of possible items of study. And now the objects of study and rhetorically interesting objectives of study have certainly multiplied. So these are some of the things that I've written about. To sort of set the mood for my talk, though, I want to show a short clip from a lecture that I hope is going to be very different from this one. So let me just show a few moments of this, and then I want to start at my talk. So hopefully we can all take a look at this. It opened a minute ago. Seeing the spinning wheel of death. Okay.
Listen, my children, and you shall hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere on the 18th of April in 75. Hardly a man is now alive who remembers that famous day and year. Well, it's a pretty good bet. Ain't nobody alive, right? In fact, I read that the oldest woman living died recently. She was 116. Oh, I know, I don't want to be. And the new oldest, a student was just telling me, the new oldest woman is 11 months younger than that.
All right, so let me just dive into my talk. If I can find my PowerPoint, which I've managed to lose again. Good thing I study digital rhetoric for a living. All right. On September 6, 2006, Howard John Hall began what was supposed to be a typical lecture for his class at the University of Florida's Warrington College of Business. To students who were taking his course for credit via the school's distance learning program, the graying professor with wireframe eyeglasses at first appeared as he normally would on camera, in a sports shirt against the blue draperies of the stage. Yet instead of providing a more conventional presentation about the history of management, the supposed subject of the day, Hall began by looking at his audience conspiratorially and reciting the lines, "Listen, my children, and you shall hear of the midnight ride of Paul Revere." Then he continued seemingly to free associate for the next 35 minutes, during which time he recited the classic Boston rhyme about the Cabots and the Lodges, discussed the etymology of the word khaki, argued with a female student about her travel plans, and talked about the origin of various profane words and obscene gestures. Even Hall's body language showed the degree to which he had abandoned all academic decorum as the cameras rolled, and his performance was transformed into a digital video file on the internet. At one point, he rolled on his back, laughing uproariously with his midsection exposed. At another, he displayed his middle finger to the camera, as you can see here. About halfway through the first segment, Hall announced, "Life is not about business, life is not about management." After the link to the digital file of Hall's disastrous online lecture was featured with derision on several popular blogs, and the video was reposted with titles such as "The Stoned Professor" or "The Baked Professor," the university moved into damage control to protect the reputation of its business program. On the instructional technology weblog for the Chronicle of Higher Education, the Wired Campus, administrators explained why they took what seemed to them to be their only course of action. McCulloch, senior associate dean at the college, said Mr. Hall had been relieved of his teaching duties, pending a review of his employment status. Mr. McCulloch said he had received a half-dozen calls so far from the curious public, adding that there are, quote, "some unfortunate things going on with Mr. Hall. This is a human problem, not an institutional problem," said Mr. McCulloch. "This man has problems." The original video was soon pulled from the university's website, and the copies on online video sharing sites were removed by various hosting services after they were notified by the University of Florida that these videos appeared to be violating the university's copyright. As university spokesman Steve Orlando explained, quote, "It wasn't really serving the primary purpose, which was an educational purpose." The video continued to resurface, however, as a notable internet meme throughout the year. It was recut as an abbreviated summary, remixed as a psychedelic version with digital effects, and parodied in other online videos on YouTube. And you can see a little bit of the psychedelic version of the Stone Professor video there. People who had never taken any of his classes came to Hall's page on ratemyprofessors.com to give him glowing reviews long after he had been terminated. In many ways, the memorialization of Hall's breakdown on the internet represented a nightmare scenario for champions of the distance learning movement, many of whom have more recently appropriated the rhetoric of open source advocacy and the idea that universities should become more transparent to the public and should embrace the decentralized distributed model of what Eric Raymond has called the bazaar, as opposed to the hierarchically structured cathedral that still represents the disciplinary organization and seniority system of most universities. In this way, the logic goes, a greater variety of charismatic pedagogues could offer up their teaching services via the internet to lifelong learners in the lay public without excessive administrative oversight or the pressures toward conformity from peers that might hamper their efforts at outreach. However, even as Hall was achieving his 10 minutes of eventual solo fame, it is important to remember that Hall wasn't entirely without minders in the room. Given the technical demands of this kind of multimedia distance learning course, and this is a good reminder of the fact that there are always others present in those kinds of courses, a lecturing professor on stage might not be the only one managing the pedagogical show. Like many who teach in programs with online video, Hall was clearly accustomed to collaborating with his instructional technology personnel, who were apparently just off camera during his bizarre lecture. For example, in explaining what was supposedly a response to the threatened mutilation of English longbow soldiers, Hall appeals to his tech person Anthony not to film the visual part of his explanation, since, quote, I'm going to shoot them a finger. At another point, he asks someone called Belinda to zoom in on this. At times, there also appeared to be method in Hall's madness. For example, Hall occasionally referred to his prepared material for the class, notes about Assyrian commerce, quotations from the Code of Hammurabi, excerpts from early product liability law, and observations about what he called management before the study of management during the Han Dynasty and the time of Machiavelli's The Prince. What's most interesting to me about this story is the second hour of the lecture, after Hall resumes the class after the break. He is considerably more lucid, although he also relies heavily on PowerPoint slides, in-class video, and other prepared materials during this segment. During this section, which few watched on the internet, Hall delivers an extended critique of Taylorization, which he applies very specifically to the distance learning situation and its principles of scientific management. At first, he's merely pointing out the university's obvious role as a Weberian-style bureaucracy. For example, when talking about the growing size of organizations, he says, think about the University of Florida. Later, he expands upon this example. University of Florida is a bureaucracy. I don't need to tell you this. How many levels do we have? We go from faculty to department chairs to associate deans to the provost to the president. I don't know, I've lost fingers here. 6. Yeah, a bunch. Later on, during the second part of the class, he draws students' attention to particular architectures of control that are present before them in the educational scenario. I'm going to pick on myself. What about schools? What about schools? You know, we had the model of the little red schoolhouse. How did we develop this? Hello, can you say scientific management? Straight rows. Everyone has their own book. Everyone has their own text. What's the nature of work? We don't work like that anymore. But that's the way we work, and that's the way we teach, and isn't that baloney? We've had enough of this nonsense, haven't we? Hall's criticism of the educational system sometimes sounds more like David Noble's blistering attack on the digital delivery systems of impersonal higher education in digital diploma mills, rather than the kind of personal moment of failure or breakdown that is so often popularized on YouTube. For many students and teachers, the advent of corporate courseware-driven e-learning only intensifies what Habermas calls in the second volume of the Theory of Communicative Action, the colonization of life world by system under conditions of modernity. Successful classrooms and online learning communities serve as life worlds by enabling dynamic, discursive interactions with students in localized situations with constantly shifting themes and situational horizons. Education suffers when units of value in academia are reduced to variations of Habermas's central example of standardization that privileges exchange value over use value. Examples such as monetary currency and votes. As Alexandra Juhas has pointed out, too often YouTube validates user-generated content only by popularity tests driven by viewer statistics rather than by more nuanced means of legitimation. Nonetheless, the mainstream media have publicized a number of notable success stories about delivering course content through online video. For example, MIT physics professor Walter Lewin has achieved fame on YouTube for his dramatic demonstrations and accessible lecturing style. As Lewin said in an interview with CBS News, he believed that the pedagogical focus shouldn't be, quote, what you cover, but what you uncover, so that students, quote, see through the equations. Often Lewin's own body and the bodies of his students are used as props in the theater of his physics experiments. The photo topping his 1999 classical mechanics course shows Lewin, quote, demonstrating his faith in the conservation of mechanical energy, as a large weight on a pendulum seems to come perilously close to his throat. And a promo for MIT's Open Courseware initiative on YouTube shows Lewin swinging back and forth across the stage of the lecture hall. As an article in the New York Times points out, at one time Lewin had also been a top star on Apple iTunes. This is an extended quotation. He was #1 on the most downloaded list at iTunes U for a while, but that lineup constantly evolves. The stars this week included Hubert Dreyfus, a philosophy professor at the University of California, Berkeley, and Leonard Susskind, a professor of quantum mechanics at Stanford. Although iTunes U bills itself as a place that primarily delivers, quote, easy 24/7 access to educational content from hundreds of top colleges, universities, and educationally focused organizations across the country, it also serves an important function for admissions officials at universities, so administrators can showcase course offerings to recruit potential students among young people who rely on mobile devices and ubiquitous computing technologies. At almost 7 million views, perhaps the most watched video starring an academic on YouTube is Randy Pausch's so-called last lecture, which records one of the talks in the Journeys lecture series at Carnegie Mellon University. And I know this is sort of a provocative comparison to kind of go from the baked professor to Randy Pausch. I know that a lot of people, in fact, people sort of who are in my kind of academic circle are friends and colleagues of Pausch's, so I'm trying to sort of stimulate discussion rather than offend anybody. Which records one of the talks in the Journeys lecture series at Carnegie Mellon University. At the outset of his speech, Pausch notes that the series itself used to be called The Last Lecture and was based on the premise, quote, if you had one last lecture to give before you died, what would it be? Pausch follows this introduction by showing a CAT scan of his internal organs and announcing that doctors had found at least 10 tumors in his liver, which represented 2 to 5 months of remaining good health in the face of terminal illness from pancreatic cancer. After completing his hour-plus PowerPoint presentation about 3 topics, quote, my childhood dreams, enabling the dreams of others, and how you can achieve your dreams or enable the dreams of others, Pausch received a standing ovation from the crowd. He later partially reprised the lecture on the Oprah television show and appeared as a surprise speaker at the 2008 Carnegie Mellon graduation. Although I would not wish to denigrate Pausch's extraordinary skills as a rhetorician or the importance of creating materials in university lecture halls that appeal to the general public to whom we are all accountable, I think it is worth asking if this is really an ideal representation of an effective college-level lecture, and if it models the appropriate level of engagement with conventional campus practices of research, critical reading, scientific demonstration, or the analysis and representation of data. Pausch's last lecture may be effective as an inspirational speech that also serves as an evocative memorialization of his individual presence, perspective, and voice as a human subject long after his death, much as the 18th century bestseller Friendship and Death in 20 Letters from the Dead to the Living captured the imagination of its English Enlightenment audience for the discourses of its fictional protagonists. But it is difficult to say that the last lecture really fosters an interactive learning experience because it presents a spectacle, in sort of Guy Debord's sense, of autobiographical achievement that was later literally packaged with a string bow and commodified as mass market motivational reading. After all, the main subject matter of the lecture is Pausch himself. For the entire first half hour, Pausch does nothing but tell the story of his life by running through a kind of virtual to-do list of his lifetime goals. During this time, Pausch displays his virility by dropping and doing push-ups, like Jack Palance at the Oscar stage, boasts of his ability to win large carnival-style stuffed animals, highlights his appearance in a photograph with celebrity William Shatner, and showcases over a dozen childhood pictures of himself. Toward the end of the presentation, Pausch expands his focus to include his immediate family. He provides tributes to his mother and father and leads the audience in singing Happy Birthday to You to his wife. In the real world, faculty members at the podium who indulge in this kind of behavior on a continuing basis would likely receive very poor evaluations from students who would want to understand the specifics of the experiments or publications over which Pausch only superficially glosses. If the aim of a successful college lecture is to facilitate the transferability of specific disciplinary knowledge, and we can sort of debate that in the lunch period, of specific disciplinary knowledge and thus empower the hearer as a social actor by sharing expertise, Pausch's lecture would seem to have a very different aim. To be fair, he isn't necessarily making a rhetorical faux pas in the specific context of the Journeys series, since other faculty members used the lecture as an opportunity to reflect on the narrative of their lives. But it may not be the kind of last lecture that every pedagogue would choose to give, or every administrator to sanction. Certainly, in the era of e-learning, the genre of the traditional college lecture is not without its detractors. Philanthropic organizations such as the Pew Foundation have been critical of the basic one-to-many format of the standard departmental subject matter talk. And I realize I'm sort of replicating that here today by reading from a prepared presentation and showing canned PowerPoint slides, but oh well. And pedagogues influenced by Paulo Freire resist the notion that students are merely passive containers who must be filled with information as they sit docilely in the lecture hall. In recent years, educational reformers have embraced campus initiatives for project-based, problem-based, or inquiry-based instruction that encourages students to take part in production as well as reception. Many have pointed to the images of alienated lecture hall students holding up signs that express their disengagement with academic work based on textbooks and lectures in Michael Wesch's A Vision of Students Today. In any case, it is difficult for Pausch's legacy to resist the forces of participatory culture, particularly when the discourse in question has been posted on the internet. After his death, tens of thousands of people who watched the last lecture wanted to take part in the drama of the Pausch family's celebration and mourning of his life, and pay homage to the charismatic professor that they had seen on their computer screens. And this is a tag cloud of materials relevant to the Pausch death. As Wired writer Alexis Madrigal points out in Mourning the Internet Famous, Randy Pausch's distributed funeral, quote, grief-stricken comments ran for pages after every obituary or blog post bearing his name, end quote, and were often personally addressed to the deceased or to specific members of his inner circle. As Madrigal explains, quote, the mourning also mimics the way that people experience Pausch's powerful oration. You interacted with Randy through a little box embedded on a web page. Your headphones piped his voice clear and strong into the center of your brain, almost as if some deep part of your own mind was delivering his nuggets of wisdom. And there's a lot of stuff about the social aspects of listening, and certainly this is something that Mimi has done a lot of work on. So you could sort of question this, the degree to which it's a highly sort of individualized and subjective experience. He was talking to you alone, not the hundreds packed into a theater or your family gathered around the television. In response then, it made sense to get personal and say directly, thanks, Randy, we'll miss you. Madrigal argues that these deeply felt fan practices split, quote, the difference between the small and generally private funerals of our friends and families and the public spectacles that mark the passings of Stalin or Elvis or Princess Di. And I think there she's sort of showing her hand. It is worth noting that Pausch presents himself as someone who often flouts the rules governing academic conduct. A close reader may be surprised at the lecture's prominent place on the Carnegie Mellon YouTube channel, given the fact that he explicitly expresses hostility toward university values and institutional procedures several times during the last lecture. In fact, much of his actual narrative of his adult life involves scenes of confrontation with authority figures who remind him about the conventions dictating what is appropriate for his professorial role. For example, when Pausch insists on going with his students into a zero-gravity environment, despite a NASA policy forbidding his presence, he recasts himself as a, quote, local media journalist, unquote, to be included, and resigns from his sanctioned function as their faculty advisor. Later in the last lecture, Pausch describes siding with a Disney manager in what he calls a culture clash involving his own dean at the University of Virginia, who he calls, this is a direct quote, our villain, and compares to the nefarious Dean Wormer of the movie Animal House. Even though, and this is a really kind of interesting moment in the last lecture, even though his corporate collaborator observes that academics are, quote,
in the business of telling people stuff, and we're in the business of keeping secrets. In recounting this episode, Pausch even uses the potentially offensive terms pissed off and pissing match to describe the conflict. Later in the talk, he puts on a prop vest with arrows poking out of the back to complain about how his, quote, pioneering course was unappreciated and how he subsequently stepped down from CMU's Entertainment Technology Center. And I think one thing that's interesting to think about is, what if he had written this on his blog? Would he have, if a faculty member wrote that kind of discourse in a blog, would it have been received differently, and would he have been sanctioned for it? In the section of the lecture in which he dispenses advice based on lessons learned, Pausch even describes subverting university procedures for undergraduate and graduate admissions. And this is a direct quote. "Never give up. I didn't get into Brown University. I was on the wait list. I called them up, and they eventually decided that it was getting really annoying to have me call every day. So they let me in." And this is just like making my heart go like that. This is not behavior I want to encourage. "At Carnegie Mellon, I didn't get into graduate school. And I was a bit of an obnoxious little kid. I went into Andy's office," that's his faculty advisor, "and I dropped the rejection letter on his desk. And I said, I just want you to know what your letter of recommendation goes for at Carnegie Mellon. And before the letter hit his desk, his hand was on the phone, and he said, I will fix this." To those who respect the deliberative processes of admissions committees, Pausch's preference for pursuing special treatment might offend their sensibilities. And then there's another potentially provocative comparison. When it comes to representing the values of the university, in many ways it could be argued that Project Runway's Tim Gunn actually serves as a more logical professorial role model in the world of reality TV teaching with a crossover internet audience. Throughout the first 3 seasons of the show, in his web persona, I've written at least one paper about the Tim's podcast on Project Runway, so I think it's probably, I'm overly invested in Tim Gunn. Gunn asserts his identity as a former associate dean of the Parsons School of Design and the present chair of its Department of Fashion. Although Gunn could be read as a subversive figure, known for his hyperbolic comparisons and for private counter-discourses about race, class, sexuality, body type, and intellectual property, his blog and podcast also validated a specific pedagogical orientation in which the reader or listener was encouraged to form alliances associated with educational institutions. As such, Gunn represented certain scholarly norms, legitimated disciplinary practices in terms of academia rather than the stage or the street, and included and excluded show members in key rites of professional initiation. He often expressed admiration for other teachers on the show, including contestant Nick, who taught at a fashion college, and discussed degree-attaining students in admiring terms. He was also concerned about the physical plant of the Parsons space and preserving it from potential vandalism. And in diplomatically negotiating conflicts between contestants, he frequently referred to his role as a mediator in the school. In contrast, StandIn at MTVU presents a much more haphazard picture of teaching practices, which are captured by online video in which surprise celebrity guests come in to sub for a professor's class. Rarely, however, do these MTVU celebrities attempt to do the actual labor of their professorial hosts by arriving with a structured lesson plan. For example, Bill Gates didn't really teach the Introduction to Computer Programming at the University of Wisconsin. Instead, he participated in light Q&A that included chatting about his favorite video games. George Clinton at the Berklee School of Music also came without a prepared talk, although he participated in a jam session in which improvisation was perfectly appropriate. Madonna's appearance at Hunter College in connection with the screening of a concert tour documentary was also dependent on Q&A, although the singer knew to ask specific students questions in return. There were, however, some exceptions. In front of a Columbia class, Natalie Portman actually tried to engage students and to cover concrete subject matter related to the assigned reading and syllabus. And for a class on art in society at Temple University, the professor praised the discussion fostered by rocker Marilyn Manson. On YouTube, the reality TV-style campus drama on vernacular video is sometimes staged, as in the case of the Angry Professor video, which has garnered over 4 million views, by showing a teacher seeming to destroy a surprised student's cell phone after it goes off noisily in class. ABC and Fox News both carried stories about the fakery of the undergraduate couple at the center of the so-called UNC Pitt breakup, which also had its own Facebook page, who had hoped to capitalize on the hundreds of thousands of views that the video earned. And it's a case where a couple pretended to sort of break up in front of a large crowd of people. And it was pointed to as an example of the sort of disintegration of barriers between public and private for today's young people, but it was also a sort of staged drama. In Zero Comments, Gerrit Lovink has described political pressures toward producing content that is combative or polarizing to gain a segment of the scarce attention to be had in the blogosphere and other social media venues. In considering how faculty-created content will be vetted outside conventional channels of peer review, it is important to keep in mind that professors who are Holocaust deniers, creationists, and promoters of conspiracy theories will have built-in audiences, even though these individuals might be outliers in their own professions. Stanley Fish has proposed surrendering the idealization of academic freedom as a core value in the university. But many fear that this approach will only make stakeholders more eager to eliminate healthy forms of dissensus and further cut the authority of the university outside the ivory tower. The mechanisms of policing faculty opinions expressed on the internet can even be exercised through procedures associated with hiring, promotion, and tenure that have conventionally been limited to print publications. Certainly, the social media practices of students have generated a culture of reaction among many campus administrators, even when such user-generated content depicts fictitious or staged situations. For example, English graduate students at Iowa State found themselves in a standoff with their department chair after 2 satirical documentary-style videos called The English TA Experience were posted on YouTube. In these parody videos, stock TA characters express stereotypical responses of apathy, arbitrariness, aggression, lust, and obsessive neurosis in connection with their obligations to provide academic labor by teaching undergraduates. When their university superiors requested that the videos be taken down on the grounds of potential liability, and notice they're making a liability claim rather than a copyright claim, it's interesting to see the kinds of claims that university administrators make when they feel this sort of anxiety about the portability of digital files. Since the clips seem to celebrate a culture of pedagogical harassment and abuse. The grad students protested by creating a Facebook group that not only reposted the controversial videos, but also reproduced an email exchange with the chair about censorship and aesthetic merit, in which another faculty member defended the graduate students' rights to free speech. Many college disciplinarians have begun to monitor popular social network sites, particularly Facebook and MySpace. For example, English graduate students, often without any awareness of the complicated representational practices around identity politics that are commonly observed. Millersville University student Stacy Snyder sued the campus after being sanctioned for appearing in a costume party photograph labeled Drunken Pirate on MySpace. Even though the 25-year-old Snyder was of age, concerned administrators wished to withhold her teaching credential on the grounds that her conduct was unprofessional. So for the education students here, a cautionary tale. And you'll notice there's also a case involving USC here. I didn't have time to discuss it, but I can sort of talk about it during, this is the Arrest Black Babies thing that appeared on Facebook. The Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, FIRE, took out a full-page advertisement in the 2009 edition of the influential U.S. News and World Report's America's Best College issue that featured Best Colleges issue that featured T. Hayden Barnes of Valdosta State University, who was expelled after posting a photo collage on Facebook that protested a new parking garage, which raised the ire of the structure's proponents. According to Inside Higher Ed, university administrators who sought Barnes' expulsion tried to draw on what they mistakenly saw as incipient criminality in his Facebook profile in a written reply to the Fire lawsuit. And this is from the newspaper story. As additional evidence of the threat posed by Barnes, the document referred to a link he posted on his Facebook profile, whose accompanying graphic read, "Shoot it," I mean, I can't even believe they thought this, "Shoot it, upload it, get famous. Project Spotlight is searching for the next big thing. Are you it?" It doesn't mention that Project Spotlight was an online digital video contest, and that shoot in this context meant record. At Ryerson University, the first-year engineering student, Chris Avenir, was charged with 147 counts of academic misconduct after joining an online study group on Facebook in which students swapped chemistry answers. Let me grab some water actually here. I'm losing the ability to talk, which is somewhat inconvenient if one is giving a talk. The issue of cheating has been a particularly emotional one for faculty members who prize academic honesty and feel that pursuing unfair advantages has costs that disenfranchise other students. At the same time, other faculty members, such as Rebecca Moore Howard, argue that patch writing is a normal part of the developmental process of student literacy. Furthermore, the text matching service that dominates the market, Turnitin.com, has a corporate model that stifles competition from open source alternatives and exploits intellectual property regimes that are antithetical to fair use through its broader business plans. Ironically, on many campuses, far more students are penalized for file sharing audio and video content than for improper replication of text that is submitted for course credit, even though this form of violation would seem to be much more central to the intellectual and communal enterprise of university life. Siva Vaidyanathan, Charlton Gillespie, Lawrence Lessig, and other digital rights advocates have been highly critical of this crackdown on peer-to-peer electronic transactions, but universities are fearful of litigation from entertainment conglomerates and feel compelled to monitor and limit the capacities of their networks to prohibit the transfer of particular types of digital files. As faculty bloggers suffer professional consequences for their public stances, many have called for a new free speech movement in campuses to address the substantive need for policies enumerating the digital rights of members of the campus community and for resisting repressive efforts at institutional branding or the pandering to powerful alumni, donors, or politicians in order to maintain valuable love marks. Librarians and IT personnel have also been key players in agitating for a higher profile for what Vaidyanathan has called critical information studies as a focus for teaching, research, and administration. Fortunately, not all campuses focus exclusively on punitive approaches to bridge the perceived gap between the culture of knowledge and the culture of information. Many colleges are experimenting with electronic portfolios, multimedia coursework, and hybrid teaching and learning initiatives to connect students' informal, everyday social media practices to the discourses associated with academic literacy. Certainly, the consequences of neglect can be disastrous for college graduates who lack digital literacy and competence in digital rhetoric, and therefore find themselves economically and professionally disadvantaged, deprived of social capital, alienated from critical social networks, and unable to collaborate or solve problems effectively. Even the most privileged students can become entangled in spectacular fiascos involving unintentional forms of internet fame. I'm going to show you a clip in a moment. One of the most notorious cases concerned Yale senior Alexei Vayner, who sent out an unintentionally humorous video resume to a number of investment banks. One of these video files was subsequently posted on the internet and became fodder for a number of remixes and parodies. The video shows a montage of Vayner involved in athletic exploits, weightlifting, skiing, playing tennis, tango dancing, and martial arts that were entirely unrelated to the corporate job title that he was seeking. It was also totally inappropriate for his intended audience among human resource managers, since he lectures his potential superiors about business success and competitiveness, emphasizes his lack of collegiality by calling others losers, and exhibits a classic case of sore winner syndrome. So let me show you just a few minutes of the Vayner thing. And then I want to show one other video and kind of close. Okay. How many of you have seen this video? No? Oh my gosh, it's a classic.
Lexi, you're known as somebody who has studied the principles of personal development for a long time. Applying these principles to yourself, you've coincidentally become a model of personal development and inspiration to many around you. Although success is different to every individual, there's a generally accepted notion that people are much happier when they grow, develop, and are good at what they do. How do some people like yourself become very proficient in the fields much faster than most?
Well, thank you. I guess the first thing the person needs to understand is that success is a mental transformation. It's not an external event. To be successful, you must first know exactly what you want to achieve. Second, you need to commit to the sacrifices that it will take to achieve your goal. And third, of course, you must believe beyond any reasonable doubt that you will achieve your goals. To be able to approach your goals with such a level of certainty and determination, you need to take care of the base first, which is your physical conditioning.
Now remember, this went to an investment bank.
Failure cannot be considered an option. It has been my personal experience that your level of physical fitness reflects directly in your mental sharpness and in the energy level that you have to take care of your tasks. As you train to provide your body with the level of energy and intensity that you need to pursue your tasks, you inadvertently train your mind too. Always push your limits, always push your comfort zone. And as you train to expand and step outside your comfort zone mentally, you soon realize that the things that most people around you consider impossible to do are actually completely within your grasp. Many people believe that successful people are lucky. I completely disagree with that notion. Successful people think in very specific patterns, which then create opportunities for them that they can seize. An average observer thinks that that's luck. Luck doesn't jump into anyone's lap. Success requires persistence, perseverance, attention to detail, and of course, patience. People around you might tell you that you will not succeed. Ignore them. When I was little, I couldn't run, so many tennis coaches said that I couldn't play tennis. When I mastered that, they said, yeah, but he's a big guy and his reaction is terrible, so he will never be a real player because he can't serve in volley.
Yeah, it's just bad on so many levels. So I'll show you a minute of the Michael Cera parody that then appeared all over the internet to make fun of this.
Tell you that you won't be able to achieve something, cross them out of your life because they're directly interfering with your success.
You have to ignore the losers. You have to bring your determination and your A game and your drive to the field, and success will follow. So let's just go on. And success will follow wherever you go, wherever you need to go. How should we? Okay, I'm gonna have my drink. Let's do this.
Michael, you're known as a model of personal development and success. Would you have a description of yourself if someone needed you to describe yourself?
Well, I would best describe myself as a model of personal development and success. And I'm a Gemini. My favorite food is pizza.
Confidence. What does it mean to you?
Confidence. Trust, self-assurance, something confided. Being confident. Some people say that successful people are just lucky. Luck doesn't exist. I believe Alfred Winstead put it most eloquently. To be successful, you have to be confident and not believe in luck. It's interesting because I'm the happiest and most successful person I've ever met or known. And I know several married couples, and that includes my parents. Some people may take that as a discouragement, but I take it as a courage builder and a confidence provider.
Okay. So let's see. Hey. So he presents the wrong genre, he addresses his audience inappropriately, and he invites challenges to his credibility from internet spoilers by his choices of video editing techniques. People, of course, were gravitated to the segments that showed Vayner weightlifting in particular, and were very skeptical about both the weight claims and this idea that he was actually lifting the weight by himself. He also demonstrates obliviousness to the fact that his social networks have already been compromised in a number of ways. And I'd like to sort of compare him with another student, James Katecki at Georgetown University, who began making YouTube videos to the candidates, giving them advice about their rhetorical presentation on the video channel, that later he was able to parlay into a full-time professional career as a online pundit and also on the mainstream media as well. One of the things that's remarkable about Katecki's digital rhetoric is he demonstrates an awareness of the conventions of specific genres of computer-mediated communication. He addresses multiple audiences expertly and simultaneously, and he enhances his credibility by using the rhetorical scene to his advantage. So I'd like to just show a minute of James Katecki for contrast with Alexei Vayner. So this is the very first video that he made on YouTube in his college dorm room.
Hi, Senator Dodd. I'm James, and I'm doing a series of videos on...
And he's addressing former Democratic candidate Christopher Dodd.
2008 presidential candidates who are officially using YouTube as a campaign tool. And I'd like to congratulate you first for being one of only 6 candidates who are officially on YouTube, and secondly, for being the oldest of the 6 candidates to be officially uploading videos to YouTube. I'd like to present you with my prestigious and coveted Oldest Candidate on YouTube award. In terms of the videos that you posted, 5 of them were from a stump speech that you did. They were excerpts from a stump speech at Howard University, and one of them was made directly from the internet. I know it's early in the campaign season yet, but it'd be good to use YouTube not just as a forum for putting up speeches that you've done and news appearances and other things like that, but to make more videos like the one I'm responding to right now, that you made directly for the internet, communicating directly to people who watch YouTube in a format that's appropriate for it. And
so in Vayner's case, with footage that could be described as a cross between an internet dating video, a pitch from a low-budget motivational speaker, and a YouTube hoax film that uses subtitles and cutting to achieve its effect, Vayner only made matters worse for himself when he turned litigious and threatened his critics with violation of his intellectual property rights. Then those who had ridiculed Vayner carefully reviewed his print resume and revealed a number of exaggerations, falsifications, and fabrications. They publicized Vayner's fraudulent claims on blogs and social network sites, and coverage of the Vayner case in the Ivygate blog was particularly relentless. Although the New York Times published a largely sympathetic item on Vayner, the New Yorker pointed out that he had a long-standing pattern of dissimulation going back to his freshman year and was widely mistrusted within his own social circles. One can create an illustrative tale of 2 college students by comparing the Vayner story to the experiences of Georgetown senior James Katecki. Like Vayner, Katecki was a white male in his final year at a prestigious university, known for its network of potential professional contacts. But their narratives diverge fundamentally when it comes to their experiences with online video fame. Katecki began making videos to the presidential candidates that critiqued the content of their YouTube channels. The first of these videos was shot in his Georgetown dorm room and addressed to one-time Democratic presidential candidate Christopher Dodd. In the video, Katecki uses what would become his trademark pencil puppets of the candidates. But there is also substantive analysis of how well Dodd seems to understand the conventions of the video genre he's trying to create. Campaigns began to pay attention to Katecki's videos. Candidates like John Edwards actually made videos back to the Georgetown senior that addressed him directly, and dark horse contenders Ron Paul and Mike Gravel even came to his dorm room to be interviewed on Katecki's webcam. By the time of the YouTube debates, in which questions to potential presidential party nominees were generated by submissions to the popular video sharing service, Katecki had been profiled in the Washington Post, the Los Angeles Times, National Public Radio, and CNN. From his modest start with his Emergency Cheese channel, which eventually evolved into his own domain at jameskatecki.com, he found employment as a full-time professional paid commentator on Politico.com, where he now has a daily webcast, and a well-publicized rivalry with a pundit on MSNBC. Despite the attention of the mainstream media, however, Katecki is keenly aware of the need to maintain narrow casting norms and sustain the attention of his niche audiences. When he appeared as a guest speaker in my digital rhetoric course, he offered to answer emails from individual students and later added many of them as Facebook friends. This year, he will be returning to talk to a similar group of graduating seniors. So I hope that during the discussion afterwards, we can talk, about questions involving how to best teach students digital rhetoric, which I think can be particularly challenging. In my own classes, I start with Facebook, and we eventually end up in Second Life. I think one of the most profound questions, though, is kind of what are the pedagogical approaches that are most appropriate? Because I think so often we're still tied to error correction models, and I think that those error correction models aren't necessarily helpful because it doesn't give students a sense of audience and a sense of the rhetorical situation that they're entering into when they're composing multimodal texts that are going to be digitally distributed on the internet. So these are some of the different pedagogical approaches that I talk about in the Virtualpolitik book. It has a chapter called What is Digital Rhetoric? And I certainly hope that we can sort of share our experiences using these different styles in order to help students participate more successfully in online interactions. So thank you very much for your time and attention. In the back?
Thanks a lot. I really enjoyed it, and it helped kind of crystallize some things I've been thinking about. I graduated from the Online Communities program and spent a lot of time in this room during the DIY speaker series. And that ended because the university made a brand management change to decide that the Annenberg Center is being switched to something else. And when I was at USC, I studied with Cory Doctorow, and we published articles how they had a free speech zone. I had 2 class seminar blogs at Annenberg disappear in the blogosphere. One because of the changes at Annenberg, another the professor decided to. And a lot of people lost their jobs here, most important, like real impact. And I kept trying to argue that this was disturbing at a deep philosophical level if you care about teaching from a kind of Socratic level, that I had trusted, or forget, that just the universities are at risk. Jen Urban argued that as a USC law professor at a talk that we put on. So, I mean, if you believe as I do that private universities, especially like USC, are at risk of kind of losing their integrity, how do they regain that? And it's different for a public university. You have a different set of challenges, but for a private university, especially one like USC that promotes the brand so well,
on the other hand, in my day job, I'm the writing director of the Humanities Core Course, which is a flagship course with 1,200 students that gets a lot of media attention because it's often sort of pointed to as, this great books, great ideas, first year, inquiry-rich curriculum. And we have problems involving Facebook and involving internet plagiarism and involving the way that our brand migrates as well. And so, I think that even at public universities, there are these anxieties from university stakeholders who want to figure out how to kind of maintain some kind of profile in the public sphere that will attract others to the institution and want to kind of support the kinds of teaching and learning that go on there. So, maybe I'm not improving your cynicism by saying that, in the University of California, we also...
I'm sorry, Jen Urban talked a lot about patents and, the production of, private, commodified knowledge and protection of it. So, I was just curious, since you are very visible, to hear how you dealt with that and struggled with it.
Well, I spoke with Kamala Lyons, who's our counsel in Washington, who represents the UC system as a lobbyist involving congressional legislation. And during the Digital Millennium Copyright Act, the universities were officially neutral, and the UC system participated in that choice as well. And so these anxieties, I write a lot about sort of well-meaning government officials who screw up. And I think that's also true in higher education, that there are sort of understandable anxieties that get translated into kind of a climate of political reaction and conservatism that is understandable, although deeply regrettable. And I'm not sure, a lot of people sort of talk about the digital generation and sort of, well, once everybody's old enough, once everybody at the university is, and all these other people die out, everything is going to be fine. And I'm pretty skeptical about that, based on my own sort of experiences as, somebody who has to sort of wear the administrator's hat sometimes.
Liz, great talk. Thank you so much. And I wanted to go back to one of the questions you posed in the talk, and that was about the visibility of students online. Like, they're crucial to these exchanges that get publicized, and I wonder how you feel about, on one hand, students should have like this buffer zone because they're in college, they're not out in the real world, and on the other hand, we want to make their things public, and they seem to perform better when they engage on a level at which the public is going to see their work. Do you have feelings about the relative?
My own feeling is I tend to be less, I know that USC has a strong anxiety about sort of FERPA-related issues, and I understand those concerns. But again, as somebody who looks at the quality of student writing, students who are within these walled gardens, like the writing studio or like some of the internal suites that go along with the Blackboard application, or any of these things that involve sort of pseudo-blogs or pseudo-wikis or pseudo-public writing, I really don't think they learn very much from that experience. I think that they treat it as a kind of busy work. They don't see it as, entering it onto the public stage. And, whenever I kind of debrief students at the end of one of my classes, they're always like, please, let's keep it something that, is part of the public realm because, we write a lot better. Now, one of the interesting things, though, is whenever I want to show samples of student work, my digital rhetoric classes, about half the students pull down their blogs as soon as they receive the final grade. Because we've been talking about the possible consequences for them. Should this particular edgy internet persona reach a potential employer or a graduate admissions representative? So, students are actually, which is why I kind of like having those materials not be on the university's servers, so that they can either continue, a lot of my blogging students still, are continuing with it years later. They start something in the class and then they're maintaining. I have a student who writes an Orange County food blog, and she's been writing it for 2 years. And it's actually a great blog. It's very lively, and she has a very,
engaging persona, and she deals with the politics of food, and so it's kind of interesting. But I think these things are tricky, and I think that students want to have that sense that they control the material. Even though the School of Humanities very generously offered to provide all the technical assistance and to provide their server space, none of my students opted to have their materials on the official university website. Doug?
One of the things I've been thinking about a lot that your talk kept coming back to me is the idea of a kind of dual notion of intellectual property that a lot of people in the academy, all myself included, which is I despise the RIAA. I think what they're doing with music is terrible. But at the same time, my lectures are all in the vernacular of music, covers.
Yeah.
Right? I mean, I lecture about other people's stuff to undergraduates, and if I was to put that out publicly, I'm essentially infringing on, a whole series of people in exactly the same way that the music industry claims that other people are doing when they engage in file sharing practices. So I'm wondering if there's a way in which we need to reconcile those two senses of what intellectual property is, especially if I'm putting my lectures out on iTunes and so on. Is it okay to lecture about Sherry Turkle's second chapter of Life on the Screen?
Well,
it's her stuff, right?
I mean, I think these are. Yeah, but these can be. I mean, particularly since the iTunes portal is usually controlled by university administrators. Sometimes they can be pretty conservative about those.
But it's fair use if I'm commenting on it. But if I want my students to understand what Turkle is saying in chapter 2, and I'm using that as the content to lecture, that's very different